Well, welcome everybody. My name is Todd Martin. I'm a grassroots outreach coordinator at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening for a webinar about the proposed Central Maine Power transmission corridor through Western Maine. NRCM is staunchly opposed to the CMP corridor and have been working for many years through the regulatory process to ensure that CMP meets a high burden of proof and to stop the project in its tracks. We have 104 people attending as of right now. Anticipate that more people will join us as we go on. Just a couple quick logistic things before we get going with our presentation. So this is a webinar. You'll only be able to see our panelists' videos and hear our panelists speak, and they'll introduce themselves in a moment. So we cannot see your video or hear your voice. For you to interact with us, please use the question and answer feature in Zoom. So down at the bottom of your screen on the taskbar, you'll see a Q&A box and bubble. You're welcome to type your questions about the CMP corridor or any question you might have from the presentation. Please type it in the Q&A box and I will relay those questions to our panelists and they will answer them once we get to the question and answer section of our presentation. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to Sue to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Sue Ely. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Staff Attorney and Policy Advocate here at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick Bennett. I'm the Staff Scientist for the Natural Resources Council of Maine.
And I'm Matt Wagner, founder of Say No to NECEC.
All right. Todd, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Oh. I'm already having technical difficulties, Todd.
All right, just bear with us, folks. We're just having some quick technical difficulties, but we will get started in just a moment.
Oh, okay, there we go. I don't know what happened there. Thank you. Thank you for everybody joining today's webinar. We wanted to talk today about the NECEC CMP's proposed transmission line. You'll hear us talk about it as the proposed transmission line, the power line, NECEC. Its official name is that CMP gave it is the New England Clean Energy Connect. The transmission line itself is 145 miles. 53 of those miles are would be proposed to be new transmission corridor, running from Quebec down into a substation in Lewiston that would feed power into Massachusetts. This project was initially one of 46 bids that were bid into a Massachusetts procurement process that came out of a 2016 Massachusetts law to try to get more renewable energy into the Massachusetts grid. It's very similar to a project that was proposed and rejected in New Hampshire called the Northern Pass. That the Northern Pass project was actually selected first in the procurement process, and after New Hampshire regulators determined that the project was not in the best interest of New Hampshire and that it would not have any sort of carbon benefits, or the carbon benefits couldn't be proven, that project was blocked by New Hampshire regulators, and then the electric companies in Massachusetts chose a second choice, which was the NECEC project. It's also similar to a project that's been proposed in Vermont that I'll talk about a little later. This project is still in the permitting phase. So it got a certificate of public convenience and necessity last year from the Maine Public Utilities Commission. It is still waiting for approvals from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Energy, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then of course all of the local municipalities if any permits are needed in the towns through which the line would pass.
So Sue, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm not sure if folks can see your screen.
Oh. Well, that is too bad. Let me try again. Okay, the last time I went in here and did this, it got frozen. So let me try again. Sorry about this. Okay, can you see this now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. So this is the slide I was reading from. So as we talk about this proposal, I want to make a couple of observations before we get into the nuts and bolts about why NRCM is opposed to the project. The first observation that I will make is that this project is without a doubt one of the most unpopular projects that we've seen here in Maine. We did some polling last year, and what we found is that 72% of Mainers say that this project is a bad deal for Maine people. That's a statewide number. When you look at the communities through which this line would go, the opposition is even stronger. So when you look at Franklin County, 80% of the population is opposed to this. Somerset County, it's 75%. And the opposition isn't soft. It's a lot of people who are very opposed to this project. 25 towns along the line have voted to rescind support from the project or outright oppose it. And these votes by the towns were not nail biters. These were landslides of folks coming out to oppose this project. We'll talk a little bit about the town votes later, but you know, they're voting in the hundreds to 1 against this project.
Hey, Sue, are you trying to move through your slides? Because
No.
Oh, you're not? Okay.
There are also a lot of towns that are feeling that their opposition is, they're worried that CMP is going to go forward with this project, whether they want it or not. And so there are towns that are in the process of passing moratorium or changing their zoning and land use laws to prevent this project from going through as it's proposed right now. So my first observation is just that this is an incredibly unpopular project. The second observation is that what we're seeing play out right now is one of the most expensive PR campaigns in Maine history. CMP and Hydro-Quebec are really trying very hard to sell Maine people on a project that Mainers just don't want. So last Friday was the deadline for expenditure disclosures to the Maine Ethics Office. And while we saw over 170,000 Mainers without power, CMP and Hydro-Quebec disclosed in their reports that they had already spent $9 million since October in a campaign to defeat the ballot initiative that's going forward that would block their project. We have a lot more details on our website that you're welcome to look at, where we break down the spending report. But, you know, just as an example, they've already spent $500,000 on polling and focus groups. And what those polling and focus groups are telling CMP is that the only way that they can possibly push this project, this incredibly unpopular project, is to convince people that it's going to have a positive benefit on the climate. That's their winning talking point. And so that is why you're seeing newspaper advertisements and television ads and online ads all touting this claim that there's going to be climate benefits. The fact of the matter is, and we're going to address this in great detail later in the presentation, but there are no climate benefits, and that this is just the message that they have found through $500,000 worth of polling research that resonates the best with Mainers who care about climate change. And then finally, as I've sort of stolen my own thunder here, or my third observation is that there really is no evidence out there that this will provide any climate benefit whatsoever. And so again, we're going to go into this in much greater detail later on in the presentation. This is really just a for-profit project that CMP has come up with to move energy from Quebec down into Massachusetts. It's very lucrative for Central Maine Power. By all means, they're allowed to pursue a lucrative contract, but the climate benefits is just their marketing campaign, and that's it. It actually won't come to fruition. And so with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk a little bit about his experience in this project.
Great, and thank you, Sue. So I appreciate everyone's attention to this. This view on this slide here is the area that I know and that we're talking about, and this is my personal motivation to be involved in this fight. This is the view from Three Slide Mountain, looking east out over Rock Pond, which is one of a handful of Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife listed heritage brook trout waters that this project will impact. A heritage brook trout water is an area that's never been stocked, which means that the trout that are in there are real native wild trout that are the original species, and that's what is a big part of why people go to this area, and Nick's going to go into that great detail later. But CMP would have us believe that this area is essentially some sort of a wasteland, and through everything they've put into their permit applications, their testimonies and their communications with the public, they're really capitalizing on the fact that people aren't familiar with this area. This isn't Rangeley, this isn't the Bigelows, this isn't Mount Katahdin. This is a real back corner part of the state that few people know, and losing it would be a real devastation. There's a lot of historical points where people haven't known about areas that were lost, Glen Canyon Dam. But this would be a real travesty, and I'm super grateful for Roger Merchant, who took this photo. He's a retired forester, and this peak's about 3,200 feet, and there's no delineated trail to the top, and he's taken this photo to share with us, to show us, what this place is. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting me share this.
Great. So just to reiterate sort of what Matt's talking about is, again, we did some polling last year, and we found that there was just overwhelming opposition to this project throughout the state of Maine. 72% of people thought that the corridor would be a bad deal for Maine, compared to 13% who thought it would be a good deal, and 14% who just didn't know about the project or weren't sure. When you break that down, the folks who there's net opposition to the project is 65%, but 51% of those people are strongly opposed to this project. And again, when you look at the communities through which this line would run, the opposition is even stronger. So the next thing we're going to go through is just sort of hashing out why people are so opposed to this project. And first up is some of the environmental impacts that the actual siting of the line would have. And here we're focused in on what is called segment 1, the part of the project that runs from the Canadian border down through the forks, and it's the 53 miles that are new corridor. So we're talking about cutting through new, a place that does not have an existing corridor. It's working forest land in Western Maine. So I'm going to pass it over to Nick for a more in-depth look at the environmental impacts of this project.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks everybody for joining us here this evening. So the impacts of clearing this 150-foot wide corridor that would run for 53 miles through Western Maine from the border with Quebec down to the Kennebec Gorge. A lot of clearing, 1,800 acres of land cleared permanently. It would impact 481 wetlands, cross 300 rivers and streams, 224 of which are brook trout streams. It would impact 12 inland waterfowl and wading bird habitats, 11 miles of riparian zone removed. And in particular, this will have very serious impacts on both brook trout and a white-tailed deer wintering habitat, which are two, if not the two most important species economically to Maine. Certainly they're among them. And also it will impact, have serious visual impacts and impacts on the recreation industry and guiding industry. Can we go to the next slide? So I'm going to focus a little bit of discussion on both deer and brook trout because they are so important to the state of Maine in terms of the economics, in terms of people feeding themselves, in terms of our history with hunting and fishing. Deer exist throughout the state of Maine, but what limits deer populations, especially in the western, northern, and eastern parts of the state, are what are called deer wintering areas. And deer wintering areas are areas of mature forest that also have browse in the understory that deer can eat in the winter. So you get a combination of heavy cover with mature evergreens that keep the snow depth down so that deer can move easily and escape predators if they need to. And also that supplies a browse for them, small trees, small vegetation that rises above the level of the snow for them to eat. We used to have a lot of deer wintering areas in Maine. We have lost a lot of those through overharvest of mature evergreen forests throughout the northern, eastern, and western parts of the state. The western part of the state where this line would go has been particularly hammered. What that means is we've seen dramatic declines in deer population in this part of the state as well as in the northern and eastern part of the state. In southern Maine, where you still have a lot of deer, deer tend to be more numerous and much smaller. The deer that made it through the winters in these other parts, more rural parts of the state, were famous for being large. And so this hunting for these deer was a big economic driver for these regions because people would come from all over the country to try to hunt for these very large deer. Right now, they're in the Western Maine where this project would go through. You can see on the left there the area in red. That's the last significant large deer wintering area left in this part of the state. And CMP's line would go right through it. IFNW has expressed strong concern that deer would not be able to cross this power line in deep snows because the snow would be too deep. It's also going to create a wind corridor that would be hazardous for deer in very cold weather. So in terms of white-tailed deer in this part of the state, you absolutely could not put this project in a worse place. You're going right through the last good, most important habitat for deer to survive in. And CMP could have figured out some way to put this line not through right there, but they didn't. So next slide. We see a similar situation in terms of brook trout. The good brook trout habitat in the eastern United States is the purple. that's the best remaining brook trout habitat. You can see that almost all of the purple habitat in brook trout's historic range, which is what this map is showing, is in northern and western Maine. That's where the last stronghold of brook trout in the United States is. And if you look at the next slide, it's a little bit tricky to see this, unfortunately, but let's focus on the left part of the slide. The line would go 100% through the light green and dark green areas on this map in Western Maine. And those are watersheds that have been assessed as intact by the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, which is the sort of the authority on remaining brook trout habitat in the United States. So essentially, Maine has something like 90% of the good habitat that's left. And again, this line would go right through. Sue, I can see you using your cursor, and hopefully everyone else can see that too. She's pointing to where the line would go right through some of the best brook trout habitat that's left in the state. What impacts this will have on brook trout is greater than you might think just from thinking about a 150-foot wide clearing, because for all the streams that this crosses, it will open up the streams to sunlight exposure. The sunlight exposure won't just warm the area of the streams where this will where the power line will expose them. It'll warm up downstream also, because the warm water will flow downstream. So this could have quite significant impacts on some of the best brook trout streams in the state of Maine. Again, much like with the deer wintering areas, you could not pick a worse place to put this project from the point of view of brook trout and the point of view of the people who depend on brook trout as a source of their livelihood. Tod Toll, who's an extremely well-known guide who works out of Kingfield, said that if Mainers don't unite to oppose this project, these unique places and special experiences will be a memory instead of an opportunity. And I think he says that very well. A whole lot of what life is about in Maine is brook trout. They're a miraculous creature. You couldn't pick a worse thing to do for brook trout than this project. Next slide.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm going to move into sort of the second bucket of reasons why we're opposed to this project. Nick has outlined the environmental and siting concerns that we have. And then the second is that the climate benefits that CMP is touting have not been validated. We actually have been fighting CMP in just about every single venue, at the PUC, at DEP, the LUPC, the Land Use Planning Commission, at the Army Corps, trying to find a way to get a real independent study done about these climate benefits, because we've done our research. We are positive that if the study gets done, it will not show climate benefits, and CMP has fought us at every turn. And when we were working at the Department of Environmental Protection during that hearing, we tried to make the climate issue part of the hearing. It would have allowed us to have experts and put forward testimony and have those claims that CMP was making about its climate benefits out in the open in that forum. CMP's attorney, Mr. Matt Manahan, wrote opposition to our request, saying that in fact, nowhere has CMP stated that the project's purpose and need includes greenhouse gas emissions reductions. That was their justification for not making it part of the DEP hearing process. So again, I'll just reiterate that this is a for-profit venture for CMP to build a transmission line from Quebec down to connect into the grid and sell energy to Massachusetts. No panel of scientists or economists got together and said, hey, you know, the solution to this climate change problem in Maine is for CMP to build this corridor. That's not what happened. CMP responded to an RFP that is a good financial deal for them. And the fact that they've been able to claim climate benefits is how they're selling the project. So there's two sort of important pieces to highlight in this debate around the climate benefits. The first is that the hydropower that Hydro-Quebec generates is not a zero carbon energy. That's a lot of what you would think seeing the advertisements by CMP and HQ. But in fact, when you look at the emissions from Hydro-Quebec's facilities, they're emitting carbon. They're emitting methane as well, most of it's carbon. The scale is also important to understand. So Hydro-Quebec's reservoirs are enormous. They have flooded somewhere in the ballpark of 6 million acres in Quebec. And that's the size of a New Hampshire or a Vermont. So, I mean, they're talking about these very shallow riverbeds that they're flooding. And so it's flooding these vast areas. And unlike a hydro facility that's located in a different topography where you have really narrow valleys where you can, and a lot of rocky terrain, these are wide and flat bowls that are drowning a highly vegetated area. And so that vegetation is underwater, and instead of sequestering carbon, all of a sudden it's decomposing and emitting carbon. And so you have this source of carbon underneath the water. There is a wide variety of carbon impacts from the different dams that make up Hydro-Quebec's dam system. Some of them are incredibly dirty, 2 times as much as a coal-fired power plant. Other ones are less so. And as the dams age and the carbon is emitted, the emissions gets less as the dam gets older. But you know, when you're looking at the first, you know, from creation to 5 years, you're looking at a facility that's emitting something more than a natural gas plant. And then as it goes on, it emits less. And then over the life of the dam, you're getting something maybe half as polluting as a natural gas plant. So over the lifetime, the emissions do decline, but it's really important to understand that this is not a carbon-free energy source. We need to be accounting for the carbon that's actually coming from these facilities. The other thing is that Hydro-Quebec is not just hydro facilities. They have wind, they have solar, but they also have a very interconnected and complex web of buying and selling. They're connected to Ontario and New Brunswick and a number of different US states, and they are buying and selling energy. And one of the things that they do very well, and again, this is just a business decision, is that they do very well buying electricity off the grid, whether it's from wind or natural gas or some other source, when it's cheap, so that they can keep their hydro reserves in reserve, and then selling their hydro resources when the price of energy is very high. And it's a savvy business decision, but it doesn't necessarily result in the best carbon outcome. And so there's nothing in this contract that would prevent Hydro-Quebec from continuing this type of economic arbitrage with their energy sales. There's nothing in the contracts that would make it so that Hydro-Quebec can't decrease its sales of hydroelectricity into Ontario or into New York or other states in order to supply this contract. They have already disclosed that they are not going to build any new facilities in order to feed the energy into this project. So they're using existing resources. So you already can't get more climate benefits because you're not adding any lower carbon resource to the grid. And there's no guarantee that they aren't just going to move the energy from one point to another. And so there's just no way we can get these massive climate benefits that they're claiming the way that this is set up. We are not the only ones who have this concern. In order to approve the contracts for sale of energy into Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities, which is the equivalent of Maine's Public Utilities Commission, had to approve those contracts. And in that proceeding, the Massachusetts Attorney General, and in Massachusetts, this role is like our Office of Public Advocate. So they're to advocate for the people of Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Attorney General hired an energy expert, Mr. Dean Murphy, to assess these contracts. And his conclusion was very much the same, that there is nothing in these contracts preventing Hydro-Quebec from moving energy sales from other places into New England. And so it's just it's rearranging the furniture on the deck of the Titanic here. We're not reducing any emissions. We're just shifting where the energy is coming and going. And in that case, there's no way to get any sort of material decrease in carbon emissions if that's all that's happening. Of course, this warning was not listened to. The Department of Public Utilities in Massachusetts did approve those contracts. So it's up to us in Maine to make the right decision on this project. Like I said earlier, we have been trying to get some type of independent study on what the full impact of this project would be on the full system. CMP and Hydro-Quebec and lots of folks who are in support of this project like to look to this study done by London Economics during the Public Utilities Commission hearing as evidence that there would be a carbon benefit. And in fact, LEI first of all assumed that the Hydro-Quebec power is a zero carbon resource, and they explicitly stated in their report that they did not look at the full system. They only looked at what the impact would be in Massachusetts. And climate change causing emissions, it's a global issue. There's no such thing as a boundary for climate emissions. It doesn't make any sense to just look at one state. You have to look at how the whole system is going to work together. The other thing that we've learned since the close of that proceeding is that at the same time that LEI was doing this report for the Public Utilities Commission in Maine, they also had Hydro-Quebec as a client, and they did not disclose that conflict of interest. And so, you've got this flawed study, and that is what they are relying on to show these supposed climate benefits. We have a really great need before we get too far into this project to have this full assessment done. And we have tried really hard. And in fact, last legislative session, we tried to get a bill passed that would have called for an independent study. And I'm going to turn it over to Nick to give his firsthand account of what it was like lobbying on this bill up against CMP's army of lobbyists.
Thanks, Sue. So as Sue said, really a key issue, if not the key issue in determining whether this project has climate benefits is what are the impacts of pulling power from the existing customers of Hydro-Quebec to send to Massachusetts. And that we know is going to happen because Hydro-Quebec is not creating any new generation. They're just using their existing facilities. And they want to send power to Massachusetts because Massachusetts is willing to pay them more for it than markets in New York or markets in the Midwest who will pay them what's called the spot price of electricity. Massachusetts is willing for their own, I think, greenwashing purposes to pay a long-term contract rate, and that will be more profitable for Hydro-Quebec and, of course, much more profitable for CMP. So we really feel that if this project is going to have climate benefits, that we ought to be able to show it in a study that looks at what's the overall impact to all of the jurisdictions of Hydro-Quebec. When Hydro-Quebec pulls power from New York to sell to Massachusetts, how is New York going to make up for that? We believe the way New York is going to make up for that, the only way they can in the short term, is by increasing their use of natural gas. So while bringing a significant amount of power to Massachusetts might cause Massachusetts to use less natural gas, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're going to pull power from New York, and they're going to have to increase natural gas use by a corresponding amount there to make up for the lost power that goes through NECEC down to Massachusetts. So we tried, as Sue said, to get this to be a topic where we could have expert testimony in the DEP process. We thought that would have been appropriate. We could have had experts from both sides discuss this issue, and it could have been done in public. DEP would not let us have that. So we turned to the legislature and asked the legislature to require a study of the overall jurisdiction of Hydro-Quebec, all of those lines and arrows that Stu told you about before. I can't emphasize enough how big Hydro-Quebec system is. And so they sell power everywhere from the Midwest, like, you know, as far west as Illinois, all the way as east as you can go in New Brunswick and Labrador. It's a huge system, and it's a complicated system, and it's a big computer model that you would need to do to show what exactly the impacts would be if you take a big chunk of the power and send it down to Massachusetts instead of these other places. So we got behind a bill that was sponsored by Senator Brownie Carson, who you can see a picture of here, to require this study. It passed with an overwhelming majority in committee, a strong bipartisan 10-3 vote, and then even more overwhelming vote in the Senate. Again, strongly bipartisan, 30-4. CMP then hired an army of lobbyists. None of us who work at the State House have ever seen an army this big. They hired more than 30 lobbyists, including Paul LePage, who later admitted that he got paid $7,000 to lobby the House Republican caucus, many of whom had told us they would have supported such a study. After that lobbying effort, a bunch of them backed off. And in the end, the House voted 87-50 in favor of having this study, which was less than 2/3 of the legislature. And sure enough, when Governor Mills vetoed the bill to require a study, we could not get a sufficient number of House members to override the veto. We passed an override in the Senate, but not in the House. And we just think it's outrageous that CMP, if they're so confident that this project has carbon benefits, that they're willing to spend millions of dollars advertising it throughout the state, should have defeated a public and open study to actually look at what the carbon benefits were. And that should tell you a lot about whether or not there are really going to be carbon benefits here. Again, in the middle of this process, the Bangor Daily News did an article, and it said, no guarantee that the $1 billion CMP line will deliver new energy. And that was a warning from the Massachusetts AG to both Maine and Massachusetts about the realities of this project.
Thanks, Nick. And I think we're going to get a lot of questions about that in our Q&A session. So another reason that we're really opposed to this project is that what we've seen and what's indicated is that it is likely to also have a negative impact on Maine's homegrown renewable energy industry. And you know, this homegrown renewable energy industry is really important here in Maine. It's Maine jobs. It's verifiable. These are projects that didn't exist and then they're built in Maine, and then we can tell what the renewable impact is from these projects. The solar farms are providing lease payments to farmers. I mean, there's lots of ways that Maine renewable energy programs, we should be supporting them, and we should be doing everything we can to stop projects that are going to hinder them. Here we have some concerns that this project, it may suppress Maine's renewable energy, and it may make it harder for these projects to tie into the grid. Certainly the project has been set up as a direct current line, and so no renewable energy projects, no energy projects whatsoever can tie into this line. It's fully subscribed, it's a DC line, so there's no possibility of any of these, any project along the route to tie into this project. I mean, so it's exclusionary, and could repress the industry. We also have really big concerns that CMP failed to evaluate alternative routes. This was a concern that was brought up by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to the Army Corps. We've commented on it in that proceeding. But really what it is CMP proposed a route that was best for CMP, and they didn't look at co-locating this line. They determined it was just too expensive and then left it at that. They didn't look at burying the line. They determined it was too expensive and didn't go any further. And there are alternatives. There are alternatives in the state of Maine, which would be co-locating it with already disturbed features like roads and right-of-ways. But there's even, if you zoom out of Maine, there are other alternatives out there. There was the Northern Pass project. There's also the Vermont Clean Power Link. The Vermont Clean Power Link would do the same thing. It would bring hydro energy from Quebec down into Massachusetts. But unlike CMP's project, this one is fully permitted, and it's supported by local communities and local or nonprofits. It would go underwater and underground, and so you wouldn't have any of the above ground siting project problems that we're seeing with CMP's project. And it also provides a very high number of dollars towards the Vermont renewable energy industry. I want to make sure that we have time to get to Matt and his concerns, and so I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about what your experience has been working with CMP.
Thank you, guys. And I'll assure you all, they didn't save the best for last. Definitely in the company of some really awesome people up here tonight. So thank you. So yeah, what we learned early on as a community member in Somerset County was that CMP could just not be trusted to develop a project of this enormity in our area. It carries such a clear threat to the communities in Franklin and Somerset County. And I've been reading the questions. And so I'm gonna move through this fairly quickly because I think we're gonna touch on a lot of this in the questions that I've seen too. A real clear example though that I wanna bring up is the crossing of the Kennebec River Gorge, which is like the last 12 miles of the Kennebec River that's not developed, that they wanted to sail this transmission line over, which is what got many of us in the Forks area's attention immediately, because that's a major recreational resource, economic driver for our communities. And they told us that it wasn't feasible to go under the gorge, and that the cost of going under it, if they did have to do that, would be a deal killer. And as we pressed, you know, those were pretty quick rollover items that they, you know, oh, okay, we'll just go under the gorge, you know, no big deal. And in these surveys, like you'll find, I mean, and this is, we learned this just through investigating this, but if we go to the next slide, you'd see that CMP, what a lot of us already know is they're dead last in the country in surveys of what they do for their customers. And I think what's really strongly known in Maine is that this company just can't handle what they have. If you bet on power being out in Jackman on any given Wednesday in 2018, you would win because the power is usually out in Jackman, and they're working on that. But in this survey, they were behind Pacific Gas and Electric, which was responsible for the wildfires in California and is declared bankruptcy. They're notorious for their faulty billing system that they've blamed on people. And I've dealt with a lot of those people in my line of work firsthand. And it's devastating what they did to a lot of people, and they've never owned up to that. And so we can't trust them to build something like this. And this will hopefully come up later too, but there's no economic impact component to any of these permits of what this development would do, especially a mishandled development in these small towns that I know and love. So, yeah. And CMP's been fastidious in their obstruction of solar for the last, in the Paul LePage administration, and that now they want us to trust them as the expert on renewable energy delivery, which is, well, yeah. So what we have is that CMP behind the scenes sort of cultivated the illusion of community consent for this project. When they first rolled it out, they put out these maps that said all the towns that it impacts are all for it, and they sent some dodgy letters early on and got some vague support from mostly just specific individuals and town governments. And as people learned about this project, people obviously got up in arms and held mostly symbolic town votes, but have passed moratoriums on the project. And now, wow, these towns have all voted. And as Sue referred to earlier, these aren't just nail biters. Some of these are crushing defeats. I mean, the town of Wilton, everybody agreed. There was nobody that voted in favor of the project. One person voted to remain neutral and 185 voted to oppose. I mean, people in this impacted area have never, ever agreed on something as much as we do on this. Here's the vote in the town of Jay. Obviously Jay's in our thoughts now, but those people rely on the forest products industry, and they know those woods, and they know the value of them, and here they are saying, no, we don't want this transmission corridor of 115-foot tall, 7-foot wide steel poles marching across our landscape for no environmental benefit. I think that we have one, is that right? We have one that marched through those quickly. There we go.
Yeah. So I think that's what we wanted to say. We just wanted to share our views on why we think that this is not the right path for Maine environmentally or for climate change. And I want to turn it over now to Todd to hopefully get through. We are a little long. There's a lot to say on this topic, and I apologize for my technical difficulties earlier. Todd, turn it over to you for some questions.
Great, thanks Sue, and thanks again to all of our panelists this evening. And thanks to everyone here for tuning in. So we have some time for questions. It is 10 minutes before 7, but we can stay on a little bit longer to answer more questions. So you're welcome to stick with us for a little bit past 7. So I'm going to pitch some questions that you all have been asking in the question and answer box. A reminder, if you have a question for our panelists, you can type it in the Q&A box now, and I can pass it on to our panelists. So this first question I'm going to pitch to Nick. Is Hydro-Quebec continuing to flood First Nations land in order to provide the power for this transmission line? And that's from Joe Caroline Feely.
So the answer to that question is Hydro-Quebec has already flooded many First Nation lands. Their existing system has wreaked havoc on First Nations traditional way of life. Churchill Falls, James Bay, all kinds of places have been wrecked by these Hydro-Quebec facilities. People who had known the rhythm of rivers for generations, hundreds of years, and depended on the seasonal variation in the rivers for knowing how to navigate them, even as simple as just knowing how to navigate the rivers. All of that changed suddenly. Methyl mercury levels in fish that they depended on for generations went up and became much more dangerous for them to eat. Migrations of deer and caribou along riparian areas were blocked and destroyed forever by these facilities. So the answer is that yes, Hydro-Quebec has really has done a terrible disservice to First Nations in Canada and really wrecked important ways which those people have used both to feed themselves and to uphold their culture for generations.
Great, thank you, Nick. The next question is from Bill Wallace, who asks, what about the chance for forest fires from the transmission line in remote areas, like what happened recently in California? Sue, can I pitch that question to you?
Sure. So CMP never did a fire analysis, but the fire response firefighters and first responders in the new region of the line have voiced their concerns about this line and have made it very clear that they don't have the resources to respond to this type of fire if one were to happen. But this is not part of CMP's packet of application materials. They haven't done that type of analysis.
Great, thanks, Sue. This next question is from Carl Wilcox, who asks, what government agencies determine if there's an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement conducted on the projects, and should that be done? So why don't I pitch that to you as well, Sue?
Yeah, just jump right in. That's under this, the two other projects that are exactly the same as this, the Vermont project and the New Hampshire project, both received full environmental impact statements under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. That is what we believe should be done here. Unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers is the responsible agency for that review, and they have made it pretty clear that they're planning on doing just an environmental assessment. We believe that that is inadequate, but that decision isn't final yet. And so we'll have to wait and see what happens, but absolutely an environmental impact should be done in this case, as it was done in the two similar projects in Vermont and New Hampshire. Maine deserves the same hard look at what the environmental and social impacts of this project are.
Great, thanks, Sue. Matt, I'm going to kick this question over to you. What is the current status of the referendum? Will it be on the ballot in November?
Yeah, so we're very happy. The referendums withstood two challenges that we were pretty sure we were going to win, and we have. I believe they have one appeal left, but they don't have a leg to stand on in these appeals. We had over 1,000 volunteers. It was a grassroots campaign. It was hard, it was cold, it was windy, it was snowy. But we have the signatures and we want Maine people to vote on it. We think people deserve the chance to make this decision. So yeah.
Great.
November.
Matt, another question for you. This one's from Amanda Watson. Can local changes in zoning laws prevent the NECEC from moving forward, even if all other permits are obtained?
Thanks, Amanda. That's a hard question. Many towns have passed moratoriums on the construction of this project. And this is a for-profit venture. It's not a public utility project. It's a merchant line owned by a private corporation. So there's a battle there that will be fought. I guess I have to leave it there. Maybe Sue would have some more to say about that. I don't know.
Can you say it again, Matt?
I just think that there's a battle on the moratoriums. They're going to challenge, CMP is going to have to challenge these moratoriums to get permits, or go to the Public Utilities Commission to override local rules. And I think there's going to be legal battles, either town by town or at the state level on those moratoriums.
Yeah, no, you've nailed it exactly. CMP will challenge this individual towns on their moratorium or any regulation that they put into place. And because they got the certificate of public convenience and necessity, they can go to the PUC to override it. It was another piece of legislation that we tried really hard to push through last session to give towns a bigger say in this fight. And unfortunately, this similar politics that Nick described about the study came through there as well. But it is in a home rule state, it's hard to see CMP take this sort of tact with towns that just don't trust them.
Great. There's lots of questions from many folks here tonight about the jobs claims by Central Maine Power, how many jobs this project could create. Sue, can you speak to the conflicting jobs claims and whether they'd be short-term or long-term, in-state Maine workers or out-of-state? Sue, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so CMP's initial claims trumped up the numbers that it was going to be 3,500 jobs. And of course, there were studies done that showed that those numbers just really weren't realistic. And now they're claiming 1,600 jobs. Those are the construction jobs. Once this project is completed, the construction phase is 2 years, then it drops down to 38 jobs a year. And so the numbers are, a job is a job, but if you compare those jobs numbers with something like the Maine Aquaventus project, which would have been an offshore wind project, it just doesn't even hold a candle. So those numbers are just for the construction phase, and they are not ongoing jobs, unlike some of these other projects that we could be building in the state of Maine that would have a lot more jobs that are a lot more consistent and would provide a lot more local workers. The part of that question was, are they local jobs? This is a high voltage direct current line. And so it's a different technology than a lot of it's different than any of our other transmission lines here. And so a lot of that work is actually highly specialized, and it's going to require them, CMP has refused to promise to hire Maine workers for all of the line. And that's because that's specialized work that they are likely to have to contract for out of state. So some of these jobs will be Maine jobs, but some of these jobs will be out of state jobs. And the ones specific to the high voltage direct current technology will likely be out of state jobs.
Thanks, Sue. So there's lots of questions also about rumors that the corridor is already being built, that trees are already being cut, and contracts are already being signed. I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this question on, but can someone speak to all the hurdles and the permits that CMP still needs before they can really start construction?
Sure. So they can sign as many contracts as they want to now, and they are definitely advertising and promoting and sending out a press release every time they sign a contract here in the state. They are not allowed to start doing earth moving work until they get their permits, and so they need their Department of Environmental Protection permit, and they need their Clean Water Act certification. So they need their state and federal permits before they can get started. So they shouldn't be doing any of that activity at this point in time. But as soon as they get those permits, they will be able to move forward.
So Miriam asks, is there any way to make the corridor pay a royalty fee to the state of Maine in the form of a fee per kilowatt that passes through the state and make that a permanent fee. I'm not sure who wants to take that one on.
I don't know the answer to that question, so I just would have to pass on that. I don't think we can, but I'd need to do some research.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah, don't have an answer there. Sorry. Uh-oh.
Many people are asking, besides the referendum, which looks like it's going to appear on the November ballot, what other steps can Maine people take to stop this this corridor project? Matt, why don't I kick that question to you?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Thank you. It's really important that people do still continue to learn more about the project, because the more you learn about it, the more you'll be motivated to oppose it. Reaching out to your representatives, we can file comments with the Army Corps of Engineers still, and with the presidential permit. There is a presidential permit. We do still have the opportunity to comment on that. And we can make signs. We can continue to make ourselves known. We can continue to hold informational meetings like this one and talk about it with our neighbors and make sure that people know that this climate benefit is a con job, and we have a lot to lose. There's more to lose than to gain by a large margin, and we need people to reach out to their neighbors that may be getting sucked into the idea that this is there's this big environmental benefit. And if there were, I would be a supporter of this project. I'm a rabid environmentalist, but it's not there. It's not there, and we need people to know that, and they need to know that we can't compete with $9 million in 6 months of spending. We can't compete with that. We have to have those conversations.
Yeah, I would say, Matt, that's great. You know, that fear, that climate fear is real, and people are looking for a solution, and they're being told that this is a solution. And so I would say, be gentle with people who are scared about climate change and wanting to grab onto something that seems too good to be true. That this is not the solution, but it's a very comforting thing. And so to help people understand that these claims are not borne out in the reality, gently. And you know, that's what we need to do, is continue to say there are solutions out there. There are great solutions. The Maine Climate Council is working on solutions. We have electric vehicles, and Matt's company does great work with solar installations and energy efficiency. There's great solutions out there. This is not one of them, and that we don't have to take every little thing and grasp onto it. We can make really smart decisions because we have a limited amount of resources and a limited amount of time to make a difference. And so we really need to focus on the ones that are actually going to provide solutions. So let's ditch this and really double down on the things that are going to make a difference in climate.
Thank you.
Great. So we have time for a few more questions. Thanks for sticking on a little bit late to all the panelists. This question is from Charlie, who asks, I understand that there are bills pending in the legislature that would affect the CMP corridor, but the legislature has adjourned early. If the legislature reconvenes, will there be action on those bills? Nick, why don't I pass this question to you?
Okay, sure. I think the most important bill pertaining to the CMP corridor that is sort of stuck in limbo because of the coronavirus is LD 1893, which is a bill from Senator Russell Black. And what that bill said, it was passed in committee unanimously, 12-0, after reviewing all the evidence, is that on top of everything else that we've told you about today, CMP's lease across public land, which they need to build this project, is illegal. And the legislature finds that it's illegal, and there are two reasons for that. One is that the lease that CMP negotiated in 2014 with the LePage administration was negotiated without CMP receiving the certificate of public convenience and need from the PUC first. That's against the law. This was done behind closed doors. The lease was signed without any public notice. CMP did not get its certificate from the Public Utilities Commission until May of last year. So that's illegal action by CMP and LePage administration, number one. The second illegal action was that the Constitution of the state of Maine and implementing legislation requires that any project that causes a significant impact to public lands get a 2/3 vote of the legislature before going forward. And just to show you how careful the Bureau of Parks and Lands usually is, or IF&W usually is about this, there are lots of little deals that happen, like you know, the state will exchange land with a private landowner, a 1/4 acre of land or something like that, to help them make their boundaries fit better. They always go to the legislature to get 2/3 approval for those kind of deals. They didn't for this. That's an outrage, and it was done because that happened because the LePage administration did not let the legislature even know that it was negotiating this lease. 150-foot clearing across Maine public lands is clearly a significant impact to those lands and clearly needs a 2/3 vote of the legislature in order for the lease to survive. So LD 1893 would have required that it would have voided the lease because of the violation of law that CMP did not get a certificate from the PUC first. And then it said any new negotiated lease between CMP and the Bureau of Parks and Lands would require a 2/3 vote of the legislature as required by the Constitution. As I said, that passed unanimously in committee. We think it would have had very strong support, bipartisan support in the legislature. But unfortunately, when the legislature adjourned, that bill was held up. If the legislature comes back before next session, I expect that they will take that bill up and find that CMP's lease is illegal and require the lease to be voided, and a 2/3 vote of the legislature for any new lease that CMP and the Bureau of Parks and Lands might negotiate.
Great. So let's go ahead and end there. Thank you to all of our panelists and to everyone who joined us this evening. Hope that you all are safe and healthy at home during this public health crisis that we're all living through. We would have loved to have given this presentation in person to you all, but thank you for adapting and joining us online this evening. Many thanks to our 3 panelists for joining us this evening. Again, I'm Tod Martin with the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and we are happy to sponsor this presentation this evening. We certainly encourage you to visit our website, nrcm.org, to learn more about why we oppose the CMP corridor project, and certainly encourage you to be in touch with us if you have any questions about the corridor moving forward. So again, thank you for joining us this evening and enjoy the rest of your night. Take care.